All right, welcome to Music Theory for Electronic Musicians. I am Jay, and this is a Slam Academy online class. So we're going to dive right in to our first topic, which is going to be a keyboard layout, finding middle C, and octaves. So we're going to start with some basics of the layout of what we're going to see when we're dealing with theory concepts at the keyboard. But remember, I said in the introduction, we're not going to focus on the keyboard too much. We're going to work in our DAW. However, our DAW is actually designed to look like a keyboard. So we kind of have to know a little bit about the keyboard in order to understand what our DAW is showing us. So here we go. So here's our keyboard, right? You've all seen one of these. If anyone tells me they've never seen this image, I will call you a liar. You've seen one of these somewhere. It's a keyboard. It's a piano. It's any synthesizer has one of these. And all this is a way for us to control notes. The only reason that we use so many keyboard-based controllers in electronic music is just because the keyboard layout is the most familiar. You can get guitar synthesizers. You can get wind controllers, clarinets, and saxophones, and anything like that. And you can use them to control a synthesizer just as well as this works. It's just that we've all kind of grown accustomed to this thing as what we use to control a synthesizer. I even played a gig once with a MIDI bagpipist. Yeah. It was crazy, but yeah, it was a bagpipe that controlled synthesizers. So people have built weirder things. So, getting back to the point, this is what our software is based on. So, let's get a little familiar with this. But actually, first, let me show you how our software is based on this. So, we're going to roll through a little evolution of our keyboard here. So, this is our keyboard. We know what this does, right? We press down on notes. We can hit these white notes or the black notes, and sounds happen. So, if we turn it on its side, right? So, I've rotated it just a little bit. And then now I'm going to chop it off a little bit. So I'm going to get rid of all this extra white stuff. So we just see white keys and black keys. The reason that over here the white keys are longer than the black keys is that's just how our hands work. Our hands sit more comfortably on a keyboard with these white ones longer, and then we can get in between the black notes to get the white notes. That's just how our hands work. But when we're dealing with software, we don't need these extra long white ones. So let's just shave that off. And now we just have white keys and black keys, right? I just trimmed the image and now it's just white keys and black keys. And then when we look over here, we get to our piano roll editor. Almost any DAW has a piano roll editor. This is a screenshot from Ableton. And this is exactly what that is. It's just our keyboard turned sideways, right? So if you've never put that together, that's what's happening here. So looking at it even deeper, you can see that in the piano roll editor, there are these kind of darker gray and lighter gray alterations that correspond to our white notes and black notes, right? So the darker gray ones are in line with black notes. The lighter ones are in line with white notes. Let's look at the full grid here. So this is the Ableton grid. We can see white notes, black notes. We can see these labels here saying C4, C5, C6. We'll look at those in just a minute. But as we go across, we see the piano roll grid. So this is called a piano roll for actually a very good reason. In the old days, we had pianos that kind of played themselves. They looked like this. And what they did was you had this roll. This is kind of like a giant toilet paper roll. And you punched little holes in it. And you pedaled it with your feet. So your feet kind of moved they pedaled basically like a bike. And then it would turn this roll and air would blow through. Whenever there was a hole in the roll, air would come through and that would make the key move. So the way the piano roll worked, it was laid out kind of like this, where we have a grid of all the notes going. It's basically a piano with a timeline in it, just kind of stretched out this way, really long, all the notes, and you just punched out the ones that you wanted. So when we create notes on this kind of a grid, it looks just like an old-timey piano roll. I sometimes call these pianos Scooby-Doo pianos because they are, if you ever watched like old Scooby-Doo, they go into like a haunted house and there's like a piano playing itself and it's really creepy. That's what these pianos did. The keys would actually move and it was all creepy and spooky. They have MIDI ones now. Disclavier, Yamaha Disclavier does the exact same thing, except it accepts MIDI, so you can basically play the piano with any other instrument. They're sometimes also in the old days called pianolas, kind of the same thing. So player piano, pianola, modern equivalents, Disclavier. Piano roll is what we're looking at here. Cool. So let's look at our keyboard again. Okay. So here's our keyboard layout. We have white notes and black notes. These are the things that we need to figure out. And the first chunk of our class is going to be figuring out what sounds best together. And one way, so the first thing we have to do is figure out the difference between the white notes and the black notes. Okay, so our white notes, and we call them that just because they're white on the keyboard. On the old piano, there's absolutely no reason they need to be white and the black ones need to be black. It's just the way it is. These are all designated by a letter. So this one's called C, this one's D, this one's E, this one's F, this one's G, this one's A, this one's B, and then it starts over again. So we have 7 of them and then it starts over, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it starts over. File that away for a minute. We're going to need to remember that. So let's look at the pattern of the white notes. So it just goes up through the first 7 letters of the alphabet, right? So we're going to start on C in this case. Say C, D, E, F, G, A, or G, and then it starts over at A, B, C. So we never go higher than G. And that continues all the way up and down the keyboard. So this note here, take a guess what that one's going to be called. Here's a clue. It's going to be D because it came right after C, right? So all the white keys go in order. C, D, this one will be E, this one will be F, this one will be G. This one, if we go down from here, this one's going to be called, take a guess. Same as that one, B. And then we're going to go through the alphabet backwards. A, G, F, E, D, and then another C. So they repeat, right? Because there's only 7. So we get, even in this little image, we have 2 different C's. So we'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, let's look at the black notes now. The black notes happen always in between white notes, right? So we're going to learn 2 important words here to get us to understand the black notes. So let's scroll over here. Sharp and flat. Okay, this is the symbol. It means sharp. So whenever you see that symbol, we say sharp. Whenever you see this symbol, we say flat. This one, sometimes if we were just typing, we just use like a number symbol. Even though it's a little bit different, it's kind of like an italic number symbol. This one is exceptionally hard to type if you don't have a special font to do it. But if we're just typing, sometimes we use a lowercase b just to be like flat. So sharp and flat. Sharp means raised and flat means lowered. Okay, so just remember that. Sharp means a tiny bit higher and flat means a tiny bit lower. So let's zoom in here. Here's our C, here's our D, right? So what do we call this note? We could call it C sharp because it's C a little bit higher, right? But it's also D flat, right? Because it's D a little bit lower. And in this case, and in the case of all of the black notes, we can give them 2 names. They all have 2 names. They are sharped. They are the other note sharped or the note above it flat, right? So it's kind of confusing. So let's look at the next note. What do we call this one? Well, it's got 2 names. It's got D sharp because it's 1 higher than D. It's also got E flat because it's 1 lower than E. Weird, right? It's just the way it works. So how do you know what to call it? Do you call it C sharp or D flat? Well, the short answer is that you won't really need to, because what we're dealing with in this class is going to be what notes sound good. We're not really going to be dealing with how we say different notes all that much, so I wouldn't worry about it. However, it will come into play once we start talking about keys that we're in, because when you're in a key, which we'll talk about later, that's how we know what to call things. So some keys, everything is flat. We just call them flats. And in some keys, we call everything sharp. And there's a logic to it, and there's a good reason behind why we do it. For now, I just want you to remember that the black notes they're named after their adjacent notes. So let's look at this one. This one is what? It's G sharp and it's A flat. All right, so that's what that one's called. It's G sharp or A flat. Make sense? Cool. Okay, our next concept that I want to get down is middle C. Okay, middle C is a little tricky for us. As electronic musicians, this is a little bit of a stumper. Middle C is the note C. If we go back and look at all of these, right? So there's C here and there's C here, and there's C's all over the keyboard, right? Because it repeats every 7 notes. So there are a lot of C's on our keyboard depending on how big our keyboard is. What we do is we locate the middle C so that we kind of use that as a home base. Middle C is middle C. It's hard for us to find. It's relatively easy to find when you're sitting at a piano. Piano has a certain number of keys. Middle C is right in the middle. That's why we call it middle C. On our keyboards, we hardly ever have a full-size keyboard that we're working with. Sometimes we have like one of those Oxygens that has like an octave and a half, in which case we might not even see middle C, like S-E-E, middle C. It might not even be showing depending on what our octave setting is at, right, on our keyboard. So if on your keyboard you have an octave button and that is set to something other than 0, you might not even be seeing middle C. So it's a little tricky for us where middle C is actually living. A couple cues you can get is that middle C is always MIDI note number 60. So if you can look at a MIDI readout of what notes are coming in, press the C, and if it's if it's above 60, then you're too high. If it's below 60, you're too low. So you can kind of find middle C that way. It's not super important that we always know where middle C is, but it can be useful to locate middle C. For now, I want you to remember the vocabulary word middle C, and that it is a C. Now, how do we find C in all this stuff? There's a whole bunch of alternating black and white notes, and how do we know which one is C? There's a pattern here, right? You probably already spotted it. So look at the black notes for a minute. We have 2 black ones, and then there's no black one in between here. And there's 3 black ones, and then no black ones. 2 black ones, no black one. 3 black ones, no black one. That pattern repeats all the way. So if I go back, let's go back to here. So if you look on a keyboard, the note C is always just underneath or to the left of, if we were looking at a keyboard laid out normally, of the pattern of 2. So whenever you see a pattern of 2, you're going to go just underneath it by 1, and that's your C, right? If you see a pattern of 3, just to the right of that or on top of the pattern of 3 is going to be B, and then above that it's going to be C. Makes sense? So always watch out for this pattern, 2 and 3. That's going to repeat over and over and over. Looking here, 2, 3, 2, 3. Here's our pattern of 2, there's a C. Here's a pattern of 2, there's a C. So C is always just underneath the pattern of 2 black notes. Okay, so middle C is also called C4. This labeling has nothing to do with MIDI. I've seen a lot of people get confused by that. C4, C5, like we saw earlier when we were looking at the, actually, let's just jump back there really quick. Over here, C6, C5, C4. C4 is middle C. It is the same thing. These numbers don't have anything to do with MIDI. They're just a designation we use for octaves. So we know C4 is lower than C5, which is lower than C6. And C4 is higher than C3. So I'm going to go back where we were. Okay. So if this is C4 right here in my diagram, so middle C, then this is C5. And this is C6. And this is C3, because pattern of 2 to the right. If we could go up just a tiny bit more, we would see a pattern of 2 black keys. And then that. So we'd have C6. So C6, C5, C4, and C3. And it goes all the way up. You could go up to C8 or 9, I've seen, maybe. And all the way down to C. I've seen C -2 comes up a lot on like some big bass synthesizers. They might be listed as down to C -2. I don't think I've ever seen one down to -3, but maybe. Okay, so why do we have multiple C's? Why don't we just count the whole bloody alphabet all the way up? We have multiples of every note, right? Because this is a C, D, E, F, etc. Here's a C again, which means that's D, and that's E, and that's F. So we have all these different C's that we're looking at, and we have all these different D's and E's and F's. So those are called octaves. It's the same note separated by a register, so to speak. So C4 is the same note as C5. It's just C5 is an octave higher. So there are similarities between the notes C and like C4 and C5, other than just they happen to be called C. There are sonic similarities. For our purposes, one of the things I said we were going to be sure and cover in this class was what notes sound good together. That's one of our main points. And I will tell you, an octave always sounds great. It's thin, and we'll talk kind of what I mean by thin. We'll talk about that later. But the key to remember is that you can't go wrong with playing more octaves of notes that you already know work. So if you know a C works in this tune you're working on, you can add C's all over the keyboard, and you'll be happy. Nothing's going to sound bad, no matter what octave you put it in. Maybe if you put it like way down in the bass and it conflicts with like some other bass thing you have. But if a C works, a C works. The reason for that is because of the waveform. Easiest way to explain this is with a guitar. So here's a guitar string, right? So whatever note is an open string. So let's just say we're looking at an E string. So if the open string is E string, then we cut it in half. If we go exactly halfway point of the string, we have an octave higher because the waveform is twice as fast in an octave. Every time we make the waveform twice as fast, we get an octave. And you can imagine that in that situation, the waveform fits nicely inside of each other, right? One that's going twice as fast is going to sit nice and smooth within one that is going half the speed. That makes for a very comfortable sound. They fit together perfectly. What I labeled here is if a guitar is 24 frets, it's not really, because we don't have any frets up here, but if there were frets going all the way up, there would probably be 24. And the 12th fret on a guitar labeled always has an extra little thing on it, like this one does. 12th fret is halfway, exactly halfway between the bridge and the nut. That's how a guitar works. So a 12th fret is always the octave because it's halfway. It's cutting the string in half, which makes it resonate twice as fast from here to here as it does on the same string from here all the way down to here. So when we cut it in half, it's twice as fast. That's an octave. And that's why it sounds really good. Okay, so here's another way to look at this with waveforms this time. So let's say this is middle C right here. So C4. Let's just go on a limb and say this is the waveform for that note. We have no frame of reference here. That's why I'm saying it's relative. We need like a time designation down here. So here's one cycle of the wave for middle C in this instance. If we go up an octave, here's C5, and the waveform would look like this. It would be twice as fast as this one. So here we have one peak, here we have two peaks. Two of these are happening in the space that one of these is happening. And whenever we have a really direct correlation of waveforms like that, we have sound, a harmonious sound, something that sounds good. So this is a 2-to-1 relationship, which means it gives a very pure sound. A perfect sound would be the music term for it. So that's what an octave is. So let's hear some. Let's put this into practice next. So what I have here is a whole bunch of C's. So you can see here's the two black ones. So just underneath that, that's a C. Here's the two black ones. It's underneath that. That's a C. And that's a C. If I just scroll up a little bit, we see the two black ones. So there's our C. They're also labeled here, obviously. So I am using here C2, C3, and C4. Just in octaves. They're all Cs. But I just made a little pattern here with a synth playing some Cs. So it's cool. It's not brilliant, but if I do this a little faster, actually, I really like this sound. You can make kind of a cool groove out of nothing but octaves if you want. And, you know, it doesn't have to be all Cs. Now I'm doing it with all Ds, right? Because D is the next white key up from C. So now I'm on all Ds. Let me scroll up. There we go. Right, so these are all Ds in octaves. And I've got a cool kind of groove going. You can really use this sound of the octave really well to create textures. Earlier I mentioned that the sound of the octave was kind of empty. And what I mean by that is that later we're going to look at intervals that might be intervals just meaning playing more than one note at once. We're going to look at times when we would create an interval that might have a happy sound or a sad sound, or other kinds of sounds. The octave really has no emotive quality to it at all. It just is, waveforms that fit together real well. So they're really good for creating grooves that don't create really any emotional tension at all. It's just a groove. Back down to C. Hey guys, so one more example of cool things you can do with octaves. I have here a Monotribe analog synth, this little battery powered thing that I love. It's totally analog, it's totally wild. So what we've got on here is a little tiny ribbon keyboard. I'm just gonna kill those for a second. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm in record mode, so I'm just gonna hold down a C, and I'm just recording a C, right? Pretty boring. So now it's looping, right? But this is my octave knob. So I'm gonna record a C while I'm just randomly flipping the octave around. So all I did was turn the octave knob and play a C. So these are just Cs with octaves, which makes kind of a cool groove. Right? This is totally easy. Octaves, nothing but octaves. Okay, so closing up this very first lesson of our online class, couple tips. when you're playing around with notes, if you stick to all the white notes, they will all sound pretty good together. There's a couple spots where you can get yourself into trouble. But more or less, all white notes will sound pretty good. Just don't hit any black notes and you'll be fine. Stick to all the black notes and don't play any white notes and you'll be good as well. Those will all sound good together. If that's all you want to do, if you just want to make really plain sounding stuff that doesn't sound bad or risky or weird or anything, just play all the white notes. Just play white notes all day long. And don't worry about it. You can sign off from this class. Thanks for signing up. You don't need to do anything else. You're good to go. If you want to do anything that sounds interesting, though, you have to combine them and you have to understand what you're doing with the white notes and the black notes. It's mixing them up that is dangerous to do. Not dangerous like you're going to hurt somebody or hurt yourself. Dangerous in the way that, like, you know, you could potentially make something that sounds kind of horrible. But if you know what you're doing, you can make things that sound really awesome. So, one more time, white notes, playing only white notes, you'll do fine. Black notes, you'll do fine. You'll sound perfectly boring. To make interesting stuff, we combine them and we do weirder things. That's where the interesting stuff happens in music. And that's where we're going to go next. So, I will see you next time at the next lesson. Adios.